technical difficulties. That seems to just be the name of the game with web streaming with me and Chris. But if you're just joining us from the new link or whatever link that we put out on our Twitter handle at HumResPro, well, if you're, why am I telling you the Twitter handle? Because if you're watching this vid, you probably already follow us. But if not, then that's great too. But I'm Nick Covington, teach social studies here in Iowa. And I'm here with Chris McNutt. We're part of the Human Restoration Project, and we're actually going to just pick some stuff up right where we left off from where the stream apparently detached. So you're going to miss a couple of I think interesting and funny anecdotes, just from my perspective, talking about accuracy, reliability, winter storms, derechos, etc. And instead, let's just kind of talk about some of the resources and the why behind our topic today of our Lunch and Learn, which is humane assessment and what we can bring into 2021 and what we can leave behind in 2020 as well, along with a lot of other things. But it is just on a hopeful note, right? Just the change, just the change in feeling that 2020 is going to have a stigma attached to it, like, well, maybe the 1930s did, like with the Great Depression, or I don't know, not necessarily World War I levels here, because they went into the First World War with a lot of bluster and enthusiasm, but maybe like 1917, at the end of the war, where people are just feeling demoralized and looking for something new. So hopefully we can leave that behind and look to change some things going forward. But, the first thing is first over here, if you just navigate to our website at humanrestorationproject.org, you can find any of the resources that we're talking about here today, and access to any podcasts, any writing, development, etc. And of course, you can always contact us or support us over here as well. So yeah, we have a pretty comprehensive research database that a lot of this research that we're going to be representing is drawn from. So depending on what you're looking for, look for critical pedagogy, restorative justice, purpose finding, or ungrading, which is what we're going to be talking about here today. All you have to do is click on this and it'll sort the database according to the topic that you're looking for. And and it's even tagged with this thing here, so you can see that this topic relates to ungrading, the relations of learning and grade orientations, quality of learning with active versus passive. So even if this is something that gets you interested and you want to put us on in the background while you go navigate through our research database, then that's totally something that you can do as well. So I clicked on that, it opened up a PDF. I'm not going to open it right now, but you can just see how easy it is to access those resources. The other resources we have are just materials that we have built that are available totally free of cost. There's shared commons, all this kind of stuff here. Anything from our progressive education programs. Want to know more about what that's about? We've got a virtual learning handbook that we built earlier this semester about what are some things that are working or could work, since a lot of schools will probably be remote or hybrid into the future. Purpose finding, and then we also have our ungrading handbook as well. So that's one that you definitely want to look at that could be related to the topics that we have today. The other thing that I'm going to mention more specifically and unpack is the evidence journal, which there's also a YouTube tutorial of me sort of cross-referencing our templated version that we have available over here, which, just let me open it up here. I'm talking about a thing. Let me just show it to you. So this can actually be, this template can be copied over into any content area, for any purpose. Once we talk about the format of it here, you can swap out any of the objectives or the standards that you're going to be using on here and do all this stuff. So what you'll find in the template are standards related to my senior economics class. So when I start to talk about how to organize this, our first unit or our first, core competency, our first standard, however the nomenclature you want to use, basically this is a fully editable Google Docs template that you can plug and play your own essential questions and those kinds of things too. Then you can also determine how you want students to provide evidence for those objectives and for those standards. So I'll talk about with my version of it here too, that I use the tool called Quizzes pretty frequently because it's something that I can assign to students. It saves it all on the quizzes website. Of course, it scores things up automatically, so kids get instant feedback. It can show them the questions that they missed in real time. They can get redemption questions on it. It's a tool that I use almost daily, but none of it goes into a grade book, okay? But it is something that I use to like certify student learning, okay? And then, yeah, so then I have them put some artifacts for learning here too, and then some self-assessment. So I'll talk through more of this stuff, but I just want to walk through the anatomy of this. And what's cool is that it's a template that can work not just for a content area, but for any standard in that content area. You don't have to change the assessment, the template. You just have to swap out whatever is the new unit and the new level of evidence that you want kids to see, and then they start to become familiar with the level of prompts, as in reflecting on the evidence. How did you rate your understanding or your learning of these concepts? What are a couple of takeaways? How can we use, have them answer that essential question if you want to, et cetera. So yeah, so it's really just a template here that you can play around with. You can edit it. You can do whatever, but we made a as user-friendly version as possible. Now, on the less user-friendly side, but one that I built it using MS Paint and Microsoft Word, just copying and pasting images and stuff all over here. But every single one of my econ seniors gets a copy of this economics evidence journal. Okay. And then I walk them through here, basically, then how can we use this evidence journal to meet the goals of the course? Probably helps to understand what those goals are. And I just frame them as broadly as possible. All right. By the time you get out of this course, I want you to have developed competency in economic concepts. That's kind of like what I'm required to teach you by law. All right. I don't have a lot of say in that. You also have an understanding of financial literacy, which this is actually a law in the state of Iowa. So again, I don't have a lot of choice around the content that I'm teaching there, but I have an immense amount of choice around how students demonstrate that understanding. And then the big goal, and this is one that I'm passionate about the last couple of years, is economic in making community, our state, or the world you want to connect to or become an expert in, or what's a problem you'd like to solve. So getting my teachers who have one foot in the world of school and another foot in the adult world outside of school, and how do we help them make connections and bridge the gap there, explore topics that are of interest to them, explains that might be leveraged into your, careers or job shadowing opportunities. Talk to people around the community, because those are going to be the things, those social networks are going to be the things that are going to help students, feel that they have, some meaning and purpose in that world outside of school, and aren't just, put on rails and moved to the next stage of their life without a lot of agency. So what I do then is I chunk it out into those things, and when it's printed off, it actually looks pretty nice. I wish I had a paper copy of it with me here, but it's full color coded. And when you open it up, you actually get, on the left-hand side, you get like sort of the goals and the progression. I wanted to make it as visual as possible for kids to track their progress from left to right. And then on the flip side is where they actually have their evidence and their reflections. So on the one half, you have like the objectives and them tracking their progress. And on the other side, you have those reflections. And then any physical evidence that they might have can just sit in their evidence journal. So that's what I tell them. I say, anything that you want to put in here and describe as evidence either has to have a digital component that's somewhere where I can find it. If you reference it here, I need to be able to find it in digital space, or if it's physical, just put it in here. It can live in your evidence journal. So basically I walk through, okay, here's the topic of our first unit, and here's our essential question. And this is a lot of stuff that's not for kids, but I put it in here anyway. Okay. But this is the part that I think people find pretty cool, because they say, oh, how do you track, right, student progress, or who needs help or whatever, if you don't use the grade book? How do kids know where they're at? So, the grade book pretty much forces me to use points, and that's not something that flies in an evidence-based world necessarily, because we know that the feedback that kids are going to need on a lot of things is not point related. And we know that when involved, what do kids do? They look at the points and the grades, and they tend to ignore whatever feedback that you get anyway. So what's cool about this is that, I kind of break down their performance into three levels, right? In progress, meeting, and advanced. Okay, so anything that's A, B, C, D, F, and anything else in between that's just too many levels of variation, right? As we talked about in the clip that got cut from our previous take, that's too many levels. We don't have the reliability or the accuracy to place students on any one of those, from 0 to 100%, there's 100 gradations of performance. And as you start to add tens and hundreds of places, there's, up to 1,000 or 10,000 levels of performance that kids can be at. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so let's simplify it down into three. We're in progress, you're meeting, or you're beating. Okay, you're exceeding, you're advanced. So, we spend most of our time in this in-progress space. So think about it like a game board, right? If you had your game piece, you'd stick your piece right here, okay? Completing learning activities. So this looks like completing learning activities. Well, what does that sound like? Okay, so I'm asking myself and prompting students to internalize this dialogue as well. What is the objective? Okay, so what am I trying to do? How am I going to meet that objective? And what would serve as appropriate evidence of learning? Now note, those are general enough to apply to anything, right? You could be reading a book in an English class. You could be doing a science project. You could be, right? That's teaching frames and lenses of inquiry, right? Of thinking of metacognition. That's not content related. That's a more useful tool that students can apply to any part of their lives, right? School or outside of it. So it looks like completing learning activities and gathering evidence of learning. So when students are doing this, we're not just learning econ, we're actually evaluating their progress on those things as well. And I join this feedback loop by, being the evaluator of that evidence that students are gathering. Okay, so whether those are quizzes, as I already mentioned, or whether they're, the group activity for the day, is that we're going to do a virtual tour of the city of Ankeny, and we're going to break out all of the factors of production. Hey, sweetie, the factors of production for all of the different businesses in Ankeny. Okay, so that's something that we could do, and then they're getting feedback on these things. Hold on. And then what we do as we gather this evidence of learning is when we ask what these objectives are. Give me just a second, Chris.
Sure. I'll jump in. So what's interesting about what Nick's saying here surrounding this evidence journal is what we're doing is we're converting what is a very traditional system, like a hyper-traditional system of giving homework every single day, a quiz on Fridays, maybe like a project at the end of the unit, and converting those categorical grades, like 20% homework, 20% quizzes, whatever those might be, into something that's pretty open-ended. We have an open-ended learning template. So students, as they move through that in-progress piece, are primarily just doing stuff in the class, whether that be the things that the teacher assigns, like that Nick is doing day to day, or things that they are just bringing to the conversation to showcase that they're learning something. Then, as they move through that open-ended learning piece, they are really presenting anything that they possibly can in order to meet that standard. That's the antithesis of a typical traditional classroom where everything is teacher-centered and everything is presented up front. Instead, in this system, students are bringing their evidence and really control the reins on how they meet that standard or show advancement in that standard. What's cool about this deck that I like about it is that you could put this into any traditional classroom and it looks like something that you would see in a traditional classroom. This is not that far out in terms of grading systems. Like if you showed this to an administrator, they're not going to be like, man, you're really getting out there in that progressive education world. Instead, it is a happy medium between traditional ed, because it still has like the standards, the essential questions, the quiz grade, that kind of stuff, but factors in a lot of humane assessment where stuff is retakeable. You're meeting constantly to talk about conversationally how students are doing. You're checking in with students, and students are bringing in a plethora of different things to showcase their understanding.
Man, that's exactly right. And I appreciate your perspective on it, Chris, because I think I get too bogged down in the details because I'm in that day to day doing this stuff. So you're exactly right. Like getting that broader perspective on it. This can be applied in any sort of area. And it is a nice bridge between, because it means that a lot of my classroom time can look fairly traditional, although I would argue that there's probably a lot more student voice and choice in deciding, how they're going to meet those objectives and things. But then the assessment part is really, I think, where things actually look a lot different, because there is no day of the test, right? You take the quiz when you are ready, or when you've completed the learning activities to be able to do that. And then I view my role much differently in the sense that my job is not to give you a grade, because I don't want any kid to go through this and get a 59.5% and get a D minus. They might as well have not learned anything at all, right? If this is stuff that we actually care about and we want students to learn it, well, let's learn it up to a level that it's going to make some kind of sense to them, but then give them some voice and choice and agency over how to show it, because that's how we know that learning is going to work anyway. I could give any kid a test and rank and sort them, but it's really just about meeting kids where they're at and letting them be the teacher in this case, in the sense of explaining to you what they know and can do. All right. So it's not the grade book assigning their grade; it's them making the case. So I view my role as like I'm the certifier, right? Because I'm the person who determines whether they get credit for the class or not. So I just need to see, can you like a pilot, right, or a driver's license test. You don't have to get 100% to be able to drive a car. I mean, maybe you should. I don't know, but you certainly can't get a 60. But you could get a 60 and pass most classes,
Right.
So I kind of set a bar thinking of that like certification sort of thing, right? What would it take for you to be able to get a pilot's license? You got to be able to fly the plane or drive the car. Or Tony Wagner's example is great for merit badges, in scouting. Is that you don't get a merit badge for taking a test about camping. You actually have to go camp, all right? You have to go do the thing. So this is where I can shift it into students' hands to say, okay, like I can set up and do the teaching, but you're the one who has to do the learning and put the evidence together. So I just have these check-ins, and that's what these stars are. So these colored stars actually show up pretty nice in the printed version, because the other cool part of this is that every single one of those stars is an interaction between me and students. So when they take that quiz, it just doesn't go in the grade book and then their parents yell at them or whatever. But they take the quiz, and then, a lot of time now, what basically all of December has looked like, since I'm pretty much done with my new instruction of like new stuff. But it's a lot self-directed sort of menu things, maybe there's some options for like red light, yellow light, green light. So green light might be stuff that you've got to do now. Yellow light might be stuff that's getting kind of old. Red light is like, hey, if you still haven't gotten this, and this, or show me this evidence, maybe that's what you're doing now instead. So you're not getting overwhelmed by old stuff. So then they take the quiz and then come find me or take a number. I used to have a take a number system too that I got from an old colleague of mine. And then I sign off on here that they got an 80% in the certification quiz. All right. Then I have my own little spreadsheet that I keep track of that says, okay, so-and-so got 80% in the certification quiz. Cool. Then they complete the self-reflection and put the evidence together. So what are 3 pieces of evidence that they're including in that conference? Oh, so the second bit of this to meet it is they have to meet with me and demonstrate that evidence. So 3 to 5 minute conversation, you should be able to have 3 pieces of evidence that meet all or most of these objectives, in addition to that quiz. Because how are you just going to take a test and move on if you don't have the evidence to support it? So in that conversation, I walk students through these questions. How would you rate your learning on the standard? So if they put the green smiley face, I'm like, oh, that's the highest smiley face. Why did you feel so good about your learning about this first unit? And then we just walk that through in the conversation. Then that leads me into some ins about talking about connections that they've made too. But then I have them explicitly go through what are 2 big takeaways. So yeah, you got an 80%, you got all the evidence, but what did you really learn? If we cover so much content in the semester and you get 2 takeaways out of this thing, let's call this unit a win. So kids will say, oh, I didn't realize that there was an opportunity cost for everything that we do. And it's like, okay, that's the major takeaway that any econ teacher would want their kids to walk away from. That's fundamental to understanding economics. Go talk to adults in the quote unquote real world about opportunity cost and see what they get you. Sometimes, right, that wisdom can be simpler then we make it. All right. And then just have them answer this question: how can we use economic thinking to help our everyday decision making? So then asking them obviously to apply it in their own sense. And usually what I ask kids here too is just, so do you see yourself looking at the world any differently now than you did before? And a lot of them work in retail, a lot of them work at grocery stores, they have jobs, right? So they can actually see, it's like kind of peering into the matrix a little bit about how is business, work behind the scenes, or when they go to the store and buy something, how can they figure out opportunity costs? Now, that's a lot for unit 1, but take a look at this. I mean, it's basically the same for every unit, all right? You've got a couple of objectives you got to check in with me about. We're going to get some things done. All right, that was a little bit different. Microeconomics, how do we decide what the right price is? We're completing learning activities, okay? So this all starts at the beginning of the semester with me just asking kids like 3 questions. What's the purpose of learning? How do I know when I've learned something new? And how can I show someone else what I've done? And so basically, we talk through all of those responses that they put together there, see what themes we can pull out of there, and then introduce the evidence journal as, hey, here's a way to meet all of those things. Because most kids say, I can show the best of what I can do when I can teach it to somebody else. And then I say, well, how many times have you gotten a chance to do that in your high school career? Teach the teacher, or teach someone else and get credit for it that you know it. Never. All right? So teach me. Show me what you got.
Let me jump in here too, really quick, Nick, about the idea of like learning conversationally through those check-ins. It's something that I do as well. I think there are 2 major benefits to doing so. The first is that students more often than not know a lot more than what they might put on a piece of paper, especially learners who learn in different ways, unique ways, etc. I found that students transitioning from a test-based system where there's writing down key terms or doing something completely based off memorization versus when they talk to you about it, might walk in saying like, oh, I don't know anything about let's say like the civil rights movement, for example, back when I used to teach history. And I would say like, well, who was Malcolm X? And they're like, oh, Malcolm X was this person. It's like, well, they were part of the civil rights movement. And it's crazy how not only do they understand major figures, not only do they understand some key dates and some major things that happen, but the conversation not only leveled the assessment piece, but they also learned during the assessment. I think we often tie so much assessment to this idea of stress, this idea of judgment, as opposed to it continuing the learning process, which is the entire point of us being there in the first place. If a student can learn while taking your assessment, that's worlds better than them just feeling like they failed. That's not going to accomplish anything. And we know that if a student hypothetically does fail a test, they're much less likely to try and learn more in the future. So the more that we can move away from that and pull that back and treat it like a conversation that's low stakes, where students are just talking about stuff, the better it's going to be for us to continue that conversation into the future. The second thing, when it comes to check-ins that I like a lot, is one of the worst things about teaching traditionally, especially right now during COVID, is looking at the grade book and seeing literally thousands of assignments to look at and grade. If you have 120, 150 kids and you're giving daily assignments, by the end of the first week, you're looking at like 700 and 800 something assignments, which is insane. It's not going to be worth your time to look at. I'm sure the majority of teachers just look for completion and just go through it. Check mark, check mark, check mark, check mark. And that really is demeaning both to our profession, but also demeaning to kids. Because you're basically saying that their learning is derived from, did you do it or not? And that's not content understanding, that's just compliance. So when you do check-ins in this manner, you are centering the student's knowledge and you're allowing them to present that knowledge to you. You understand conversationally how every single student's doing, and you get to develop that relationship, which also coaches them to get better. And also you take away practically, virtually, all of the time that you would have spent at home doing these assessments. Like I do now because of virtual learning, but usually I don't do a lot of grading at home. My grading or assessment piece all happens in the conversation with the student, and the student walks away knowing if they're doing well or they're not doing so well. And a key piece, when we say not doing so well, it's different in progressive ed inside of even a traditional classroom environment, is that not doing well means you can still do better. No one's walking away from this conversation going like, oh, I failed and I suck. No, if you're not doing so well, there are opportunities to catch up, and those are presented by the teacher. And there's a lot of, I mean, for lack of a better way of saying it, like hand holding, which is intentional. Like you have to help students get back up and rise up to the level of their peers. And you can help your students then who are doing really well to push themselves to go even further instead of just getting an A and just calling it quits and be like, okay, I got an A. There's nothing else for me to do, so I must be a master of economic or history or digital media knowledge without ever being pushed further. That conversational piece is really, really powerful, and this opens up those conversations in a nice templated way.
Amen to that. Yeah, it's all about like respecting the student and their process and not molding them to whatever pre-fit pathway you have already built, right? To say every student must pass through every single one of these assignments because they all count equally and everyone learns the same. Right? There's a level of things that of evidence finding on here that says what is going to work for some kids is not going to work for others. So why should I value all of that evidence equally in the grade? Well, it doesn't, right? I shouldn't have every kid pass through the same thing, but as long as they can meet the benchmarks, right? They can meet the standard using the level of evidence that I have set out here. They have to have at least 3 pieces of evidence, right? They have to at least pass the certification quiz. They have to at least get through a conversation with me, right? And if they can do those things, then they're good, right? So it's not bound necessarily to a timeline. If you get that in 6 weeks or 12 weeks or 18 weeks, it doesn't matter. Right, but kids are going to go at their own pace. They're going to find the evidence that is going to be most useful for them. They're going to go back through and redo the learning as many times as it takes for them to understand that. And once students really understand that that's like the culture in my classroom, it's such a great thing. It takes a few weeks to get into that mindset, but kids just know then like that my room is like that haven. It's like that solace, that place where they know where it's not super high stress or high stakes. And my room is a room of engagement. Kids are busy. They're working on stuff. I'm helping them graph supply and demand curves, right? I'm over here working with this student on this. I'm giving this kid a quizzes code. I'm checking in with them on all these things. Hey, where are you at on your EverFis, which is our financial literacy platform, right? It's like, you got to get these scores up to 80%, this and that and the other thing. So every kid is kind of in their own, a collaborative space, an individual workspace, or even a workspace with me, and they're getting stuff done, right? The goal is learning and to show it. Oh, so that's what I was going to say here to wrap up the semester, right? When I tell them, okay, here's your final, turn in your evidence journal. The metaphor that I used in our take one of this conversation was landing the plane, right? What sense does it make to, spend all this time getting off the ground and in flight and then just abandon, right, parachute out because we got the end of the semester and you're, racing to get some content done. Like, let's wrap things up in a coherent and concise way and end this. And then the result at the end of this is your completed evidence journal. And I wish so badly that I had a copy, but they're all at school. And what's cool about that is then anybody who's asking, oh, why did so-and-so get an A? Right? What did you didn't put anything in the grade book all semester. How do I know they got an A? Hand them the evidence journal and they can see for themselves. Because then you can say, here's where they met all these criteria. Here's where I modified things because we've been on a hybrid schedule and we were remote for 2 weeks or whatever the case might be, right? I have that ability, I'm not bound to the grade book. I can change things how I want to. So here's how I modified things. Here's how they met those criteria. Here's their evidence. Take a look, right? So you can bring the receipts to every single conversation. Parents want to know. You go to parent-teacher conferences. What's the first thing they ask? About the grade book? I don't care about my kid's grade book unless it's causing me some kind of stress that I have to go get mad at my kid about. But it's an entirely other thing to sit across from a parent and hand them their kid's evidence journal and be able to walk through with them and say, hey, here's what they've done. Check it out. See what they can do. And then if they are missing things, you say, hey, don't worry about it. We're going to work on this in class tomorrow. They gotta, show some evidence that they can graph the law of supply. We're working on this. Okay. They've got the whole entire semester because we're here to learn. Right. And that's what we're getting done. We're not here to rank and sort and get your kid a D-, so they can, get the credit and get out of here. We're here to have a productive learning space, and I'm going to help them do that. So it really is, I've sat in the hallway. I've told you this story before, Chris, but sitting and having these conversations with students. I'm out in the hallway, they've got their evidence journal out here, and my administrator comes walking up the stairs, because we're sitting out next to the stairwell, and he stops a couple of steps up on the stairs and is listening for a little bit, and I can kind of tell that he's listening, and we're kind of going through the conversation with the student, and I kind of paused just to see if there was anything that he needed, and I was like, oh, can I help you with anything? Is there anything I need to get done? And he was like, no, I just heard that you've been doing this, and it's great to hear. And literally, this sounds like a joke, but literally reaches over the handrail and gives me a handshake with a big smile on his face, right? Because you're hearing kids talk about school and learning and having this relationship between me and students, right? Like, there's a lot going on in this conversation, not just about learning content, but building connections, social emotional learning. I mean, student conversations, throw in all these things. Follow up with that. Our principal leaves our building and goes and becomes a curriculum director at a neighboring district. I still have his daughter in my class senior year. Comes back to parent-teacher conferences and gets to see the evidence journal. This is a thing that, what do administrators want to see, right? They want to see that you're making this, and instead, this isn't going to work for me.
It looks like we lost Nick just for a second. I did want to, let me make sure that he knows that. So I did want to also share what I'm doing in my current class. It's a little bit different than Nick's, and it works for me in digital media. I have a little bit less structure in mind, just given the nature of the class and during what we're doing here with COVID. So this is a COVID example. Typically, I would use a more portfolio-based system, which still is a portfolio, but it's a little bit less structured than a traditional portfolio would be. We're just doing monthly check-ins. And you can see on here essentially how this works. It's quite simple. We do a project every month, and that project is usually a few different things. There might be like a build up to the project, maybe some key terms or something, the project itself, and maybe a reflection on that project. And I'll kind of write out those assignments and what they are. Maybe it's 3 assignments typically, or the student will suggest different assignments. Those will be approved and submit those instead. So everything is very open-ended. For example, if they don't like the project we're doing, or they don't like the key terms, they want to present them in a different way, as long as we are relatively close to the standards, I'm pretty open to them sharing those ideas. So one of these two things happen. Then once those things are submitted, I leave them feedback. This year I'm using Floop, which I've been enjoying a lot. We have a podcast over Floop where we interviewed one of the co-founders, Christine Witcher. It's a pretty cool platform that allows you to leave feedback without a grade. It's quite simple to use. And then once I leave that feedback, the student then resubmits. No matter how good or maybe not so good the assignment was, they end up resubmitting that work, and then they receive a grade and resubmit up to 3 times. So in my new system, it is a little more traditional for COVID because we were required to give grades on every single assignment in our district. However, at least in this system, there's always feedback first before anything is given. To be honest, if it isn't really that great the second time, I still don't record a grade. Typically, I encourage them to resubmit again because I really don't want anyone to see a D or an F as the first grade that they receive. But Nick, I was just walking through my COVID adapted grading scheme, which is feedback first, and then you're graded based off of the feedback that you implement, which I like this a lot, where the student knows right up front exactly what they need to do in order to receive an A. And it tends to be in my class, you either receive an A or there's, depending on the student, they might receive, I don't know how it's going to work this year, but they might receive an F. They can retake the class, but it's usually someone who is not present in the class, someone like chronic absenteeism, something like that. Most people will get A's. And the thing that's cool is that students who maybe really struggle with computers, which my class is very computer driven, using like Photoshop and things of that nature, their feedback is going to look very different than someone who wants to major in art once they leave my class and has been working on like shading techniques for the last 4 years. And what I really like about this, and I'm definitely going to preserve coming out of COVID, is my students who are traditionally A-level students have to go back and do some really cool stuff with their work. And it takes their work to like, I don't know, S level. It's above an A. It's like, it's getting to like the point where it's like, man, that's like professional quality work. Whereas before, once I would give them the A and say, yeah, you met the standard, it was over. Like, it's very difficult to convince a student, no matter how nice you are or like how engaging your class is, to have them keep doing stuff when there's other things that are on the table, or you're a kid. So it allows a push further for all students, and it allows everyone to be graded at whatever level that they're at, as opposed to having everyone meet the exact same standard, which is not realistic, nor is it really that valuable. I'd rather have all students improve at a certain level as opposed to just leaving it on the table. I will say that the number one piece of feedback I get on this when I survey students is they like it in steps. So like there might be 5 things for you to do. They do those 5 things and they turn in knowing that they received an A. There isn't going to be 5 more things that are added on unless there was something else that was changed along the way. As long as they fix those 5 things, they have an A. And it really is that simple. Just like your system, Nick, it takes away the stress, and it also allows for students to really submit whatever they want. It's very open to what it is they can do. As most teachers know, the standards in most classes, unless you're teaching like an AP class, are fairly broad. You can hit those standards in a lot of different ways, and this allows students to really maintain control of how to do that while still giving some teachers the power to say, hey, these are some assignments that you could do. And it takes stress off teachers or students in another way. Really quick, I taught a semester once where I went completely student-centered and said, hey, here are the standards, you do whatever you want. And that backfired because if you're not a teacher, it can be difficult to come up with ways to present those different ideas. So when you present some ideas up front and say, hey, you could do this, this, and this, the majority of students are going to do those things. But at least there's a choice for the student to do something different. And I think that makes a powerful difference. So there's still a place for teachers to make some cool content. It's just not the end all be all. It's not a compliance by engagement system where you make really cool assignments and you expect everyone to do it because you think it's cool. But instead, you're making really cool assignments because you're giving students the option to do that assignment, which I think is a major shift philosophically that's important for everyone to understand.
Yeah, it's so awesome. And a couple points on that, Chris. I think what I think is so awesome about that is for all the talk that we have and you hear on Twitter and in the real world too about the real world, as I used it in a sentence just now. But what a more authentic way to evaluate student work than the process that you just described. If you were an editor submitting if you were a creative person submitting any amount of creative work to an editor, rather, that's exactly the kind of feedback that you're going to get.
Right.
Or any editor, I guess, that's worth their salt. If they're just going to say, oh, there's no typos, it's good to go, and not give any pushback or feedback about what you could actually, do to move your creative work, be it writing or artwork or, video or whatever the case might be, they're going to push you to express yourself in new and different ways than what you've done in the past, or to do it in ways that might make more sense or might be able to connect with a reader or an audience member in a more interesting way. So that's exactly the work that you're doing there. You're establishing, a floor of standards for kids to be able to meet, but then a high ceiling, for students who are going to readily meet those. But then you're going to say, this is not good enough for you. And here's how I think that you can elevate this to the next level. And that really is just next level teaching, period. Because we would never say that about an athlete that, oh, they're good, they're done. You ran as fast as you're going to run, but in academics, it's fine. You got 100%. That's as smart as you're going to be. You got all the stuff. There's nothing better you can do. So what it really says is that grades are a conversation ender.
Right.
Students get students get the grade that they want, or the grade that they need to keep people off their backs, or to avoid negative consequences. But they won't do a whole lot more, not because they don't care, but just because they've gotten what they want out of things. I want a B because that's what my parents want, and as long as I have a B, I'm not worried about it. I'm not going to think about math. I'm not going to think about social studies. I'm not even going to think about it because I don't care. It's that the grading system puts that in place for them, right? It forces them to not be able to think. It forces them to not care, because what does it communicate? It's value by grades. But if you turn in work and you say, no, here's how you're going to do this thing better, or how can I help you express what I know that you can do, like any good teacher or coach or whatever would do in the world, it lets us be that person. Absent.
To jump in really quick too.
Yeah.
A critique that I've thought a lot about recently that I'm trying to do better at in my class is the idea of shifting power to students so that they don't feel judgment and they don't feel like they basically have to ask for feedback as well as instead of being given feedback. Because I do struggle with the idea of, hey, I'm telling you exactly what to do and you have to listen to me, even if it is like that certification piece. So what I've been working at doing is when students submit things, they ask for what feedback they want on things, with the caveat, and I level with them that, like, I gotta have you guys meet the standards. But I tell them that up front, like, hey, like, I realize that it might suck for me to tell you that you need to improve on your work and that you may not even want to submit this work to me, but like, that's just where we're at right now. And I think it's good to talk to your students about the power that you have within your relative position and recognizing that the machine of learning is greater than just what's happening in your classroom. There's a really good critique out there that in true liberatory learning, students wouldn't have to submit anything at all, that everything would just be, you just kind of work in the class. If you don't want to submit, you don't have to, which I think is great in principle, but it's not going to work in a public school because that's going to put your job on the line. Instead, we can at least tell students, hey, I'm pushing this as far as I possibly think I can. Here's my thought process on this. So when you submit something to me, recognize I got to give you this kind of feedback, but I'm there to help you. It's coming from a place of care and authenticity, as opposed to just like hiding everything from them. I think it's bad practice to go like, like, this is how it is, deal with it. And then that's just the end of the conversation. I think that the students deserve to be involved in that conversation about your thought process, about your pedagogy, because ultimately it's going to develop even more relationships and lead to even further conversation, which is really the cornerstone of what we're talking about here today.
Yeah, and what you're doing there too, Chris, is that you're pulling back the veil on the power structures too. So you're bringing kids into that conversation, not just about their work and the content of the course, but about the power relationship between students and teachers relationship to the bigger structures of school, and of course, like in a public school setting, then how that connects to everything else too, the limitations of my job or in your job, for example. And so that's in the switch of language, I think we've moved away from like going gradeless, just recognizing how big of how much of a hurdle that is for like most people to ever even think about achieving. So they don't start, but there are certainly ways to diminish the salience of grades and grading and to ungrade, and especially on a spectrum, to be able to humanize your practice within your classroom walls, while also, as one of our themes at HRP has been for a while, to like leverage your power and your privilege that you have, to be able to change the systems more broadly for everybody else, because gradeless learning and ungrading and all those things are connected to so many other classroom practices. When you bring in students into questions of power and who has it in the classroom, right? You're engaging them in that critical conversation, right? That critical theorists would ask, but you're never asking students, to do that. But by doing that, you're inaugurating them. You're bringing them into those conversations. So maybe they would start questioning those too. You don't have to sit down and have a seminar about teacher power or something like that. But when you bring them into that conversation, that's what you're doing, without them even realizing it. So then as they go into other classrooms, maybe they start to ask questions about, why is it this way in McNutt and Covington's rooms and it's not in other workplaces, right? Why do these teachers act some way and some act another way? Why, you're starting to develop those mindsets in kids that provide a critical lens on the structures of power. And I think, ultimately, if we want kids to be the responsible citizens, that's got to be a thing that we do anyway. It's not about sitting down and having a Socratic seminar about this, that, or the other thing, but just modeling, that use of power and making it transparent for the kids in your room.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's very well said. And I think about that terminology piece too, in terms of that idea of going gradeless, and what that means. I don't want to get on too much of a tangent here, but I see an obvious parallel. And I brought this up with Aaron Robb in a podcast we had a few episodes back about the defund the police movement, kind of shifting like police reform to education reform. And when we say defund the police, most do not mean literally like abolishing the police force. It means shifting that to something different, and in that case, mental health. Well, going gradeless is a very similar concept. I think that for most teachers, not at the district level, but for most teachers, going gradeless means stepping away from grades as much as possible and shifting that system. However, there are certainly calls at a higher level, like at a district level, to make that literal, like mastery transcript, to get rid of grades entirely. So it really is pushing as far as we possibly can within our own power dynamic to make progressive education happen, while realizing that as we build this coalition of other educators at a classroom level, that will shift district and state level policy. If enough teachers start doing portfolio systems, that's just going to become the thing that people do. There might still be a grade at the end of the day, but at least if you have that portfolio structure in place, that can lead to a conversation with districts saying, well, if this is how this is working, is there a way we can make this work without grades entirely? Because it's working kinda. Let's pull that trigger to make the next step happen. And there are people working to make those next steps happen. And it's going to take more than one person doing a top-down approach to see that shift.
Yeah. And just imagine if the goal of school became, not just get out either with the least amount of effort possible or just get out with the grade that you want, but like you're going to have to leave here with like some evidence that you spent this time well. and that could be a portfolio. Maybe that's an exit interview. Maybe that's like a senior, I don't want to say like a thesis necessarily, but like some conversation about like a thesis defense. Like you have to sit here and you've got to tell us how you spent your time in high school and the connections that you made and the things that you did that were worthwhile, because that actually helps take the heat off of that academic part a little bit and says like, okay, so what do you actually care about? How did you help meet those goals? How did you help the people around you in your building? How did you contribute to your community in your time in high school? And again, because this conversation about the real world, quote unquote, is just rolling around in my brain in the last week from what I've seen on social media. It just is interesting to think about a world in which students spend the first almost 2 decades of their life in school kind of being put on rails and guided by bells and controlled by grades, and right. We've already seen what the data says about student engagement, that it declines over time the longer that they're in school, that they ask fewer questions, that they're less curious. Like how do you leave school being less curious and asking fewer questions than when you went in? In fact, I'd argue that probably the kids who ask more questions and are more curious by the end probably don't get good grades as the people who sit down and do what they're told and turn all their assignments in on time and have the highest GPA. So I think the research probably bears that out too. But what I'm trying to say is if we shift the goal of the outcomes, right, meaning that if we all start taking this portfolio thing seriously or asking for the receipts, and then we look at the sum total of what your high school education is, and this is it. It's this piece of paper that has a list of classes grades on it. Who cares, right? Nobody's ever asked me about anything that I did in high school related to a transcript or a GPA, as long as it was enough to get me into college. And I haven't had to think about it since I graduated. I haven't thought about high school except through my lens as a teacher since high school as well. But if we shifted that and shifted the outcomes, man, think about what we could do. Think about how the structure of class would shift to try and meet some of those other goals. To say, well, how am I going to raise my GPA? How are we going to help the community today? What are we going to do to help, meet what UN Sustainable Development Goal are we going to work as a building to try and address in our community? I mean,
Yeah.
this is why the people in the Human Restoration Project circle are so powerful, because they actually have reimagined those outcomes, and then through backwards design, right, design the structures of school to meet those goals. And I think they're doing great work with kids. And it's almost too bad sometimes that our focus is just so much on certifying content and doling out grades, as though those things are going to matter in 5 years or whatever. But really just shifting the outcomes of school, not even with a mastery transcript, but just getting kids to do things a little bit differently at a district level could make a huge difference.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. And I think that the main concepts that we've explored here today, everywhere from student power, the conversational dialogue towards learning, toward teaching during the pandemic, all really center itself on this idea of shifting power as much as possible to students when it comes to assessment. Anything that we can do to ensure that teachers aren't just doing a top-down, here's what you do, replicate it, submit it to me every single day, the more we can get rid of that and shift towards show me what you can do, and then kind of do what you want and have a conversation with me about it, and making that more humane, it's going to benefit everyone involved during a normal school year, but especially in the next 3 or 4 months going forward, if you haven't done so already. So I think with that being said, and Nick, unless you have any other major updates to add, I would just encourage people to check out humanrestorationproject.org, check out our resources on there, our ungrading handbook, our virtual learning handbook, as well as all the research that backs up all these statements. The thing I'm always blown away by is the people that think that progressive education is like some pie in the sky. No one does it. It's fake or like just hippie stuff. The fact of the matter is that if you talk to any child developmental psychologist and ask them about grading, or ask them about critical pedagogy, or ask them about sharing power with students, they're going to tell you like, no, it's actually how people learn. They've done it for hundreds of years, thousands of years. And it works, and the research is out there to back it. So if you're looking for any of that stuff, please visit us on our website and support us there as well. So we'll talk to you all soon, and good luck.